Welcome to BuzzHouse, a Baker Tilly podcast where you can find all the buzz around multifamily housing. I'm Don Bernards, the partner in charge of Baker Tilly's multifamily housing practice.
And I'm Garrick Gibson, a partner at Baker Tilly, also specializing in consulting on multifamily housing transactions across the country.
Each week, we'll bring you a guest or a topic in the multifamily housing industry that will help you win now and anticipate tomorrow. Let's get started.
There are many ways a person can use their expertise as a force for good in the realm of affordable housing. Our guest today is a great example of that, using her experience, knowledge, and influence to improve low-income communities via affordable housing. Joining us will be real estate asset manager, investor, author, affordable housing solutionist, and compassionate capitalist, Marjy Stagmeier. Marjy is a founding partner of TriStar, a nationally recognized real estate investment firm in Atlanta. And she's led the firm to develop its sustainable housing model that targets blighted and marginalized apartment communities near failing elementary schools. She has forged partnerships with educators, medical professionals, municipalities, nonprofits, and foundations in order to reduce the tenant transiency and improve outcomes. And she's also the author of a recent book on her experiences working in affordable housing called Blighted. Marjy will discuss all of these topics with us and more, and we're so excited to speak with her. In addition, we have Matt Paschall, a colleague here at Baker Tilly, who's going to sort of give a little introduction to how he actually met Marjy.
Thank you, Garrick and Matt, for having me on your show. I really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you for being on our show. And Matt, thank you for being on as well as a guest here. That's going to give some insight into how you've met Marjy. But before we get started, Marjy, why don't we go ahead and just let us know a little bit about that journey that we just talked about and how you came about where you're at now with TriStar and some of the things within the book that you want to highlight.
So I was a Monopoly champ of my sixth grade class in public school in Atlanta, Georgia. And I told my parents I was going to be a landlord when I grew up. And my father told me to go take the CPA exam, which I passed, and went straight into real estate. I am an asset manager. I like all asset classes. I look for ways to create value. And my favorite all-time asset class of commercial, residential is affordable housing. I just have a real passion for it.
Thank you for that brief introduction. And since we have Matt joining us today too, Matt Paschall, why don't you give our listeners a quick intro?
Yes. Hi, everybody. I'm Matt Paschall. I'm the National Program Director of Baker Tilly's DevelUP initiative. And our DevelUP initiative is really focused on how Baker Tilly can best serve and support emerging underrepresented developers across all aspects of real estate. And in this case, more specifically, affordable housing development and community development work.
Perfect. Thanks. So before we get into questions with you, Marjy, directly, Matt, how did you actually meet Marjy?
So as I was in the early stages of planning for DevelUP 2023, I was recommended to connect with Marjy from Natalie Kaiser, who leads House ATL in Atlanta. And she said, if there's someone that you have to have at this conference, you need to make sure that you speak to Marjy. And so I reached out to her via email and we were able to connect almost immediately and was just blown away by her passion, the innovative business model, her journey to getting to where she is right now, which I know that we're going to get into a little bit, but was just very moved by being at the intersection of education outcomes, health outcomes, and real estate in a way that I hadn't seen before in my career. And so I wanted to make sure that she was able to speak at DevelUP, and thankfully she's free and she'll be there. But that's a little bit more context.
Well, thank you. And glad you got her on BuzzHouse as well. You are clearly a fan. And I think after this podcast, most of our listeners will be as well. So Marjy, why don't we go ahead and jump in? First question. So what was the problem you saw in this marketplace and what actually moved you to address it?
So I think there are so many problems. There's supply, there's demand. We are in a market with aging housing inventory. If you look at the U.S. Census, more than 60% of apartments that are occupied today were built before 1993. So you can see our inventory is now over 30 years old, the majority of it. But I think the most important thing that I saw in the marketplace was there's a disconnect in the capital markets. The capital markets are not very forgiving for-profit affordable housing. And let me give you an example. When we first started, a lot of our investors wanted 15, 20% returns. But unfortunately, to achieve those returns, you have to significantly raise your rents. So the affordable housing and the capital markets don't really combine. And that's probably the biggest problem I see in the marketplace right now. So we've been on a mission to try to identify and source low-income capital. And that's really been a journey. It's been a hard, heavy lift, but I feel like the markets are finally starting to visualize and understand the value of affordable housing in their communities. So we're starting to get a lot of love from the capital markets.
Well, that's good news. I would imagine over the last several years, the pandemic must have had a pretty significant effect on that.
It did.
How did you actually take care of tenants during this time frame?
So our model combines housing, education, and healthcare, which were all affected during the pandemic. TriStar is a for-profit model, but Star C is a non-for-profit, and we offer wraparound community services, not only to our apartment communities, but to any apartment community in Atlanta. And so during the pandemic, we started an eviction relief fund. Our goal was to raise $50,000. We actually raised $12.5 million. We were very surprised. So we were able to extend the program out to over 300 landlords in Atlanta, not only our own tenants, but we helped about 4,200 families pay rent. Another way we worked during the pandemic was we helped our tenants get access to high-speed internet access. We helped them get laptops, and we worked with the local food bank, the Atlanta Community Food Bank and the Atlanta Public School, to basically help our families make sure they had the resources during the pandemic to stay in their school and to be able to continue their academic learning.
That's great. That's amazing. I mean, currently right now we're working on some CMF, Capital Magnet Fund stuff, and it's all within the same spectrum here. You did mention healthcare, that word healthcare, in your last response as well. And so I know that we're seeing a lot of healthcare dollars out there, and we've had some podcasts on that before. From your perspective, because I'd like to get your perspective, how do we get more healthcare dollars into housing services and economic development?
So I think the healthcare providers are starting to recognize the impact of housing on healthcare. I am recently learning about the social determinants of health. In our model, without really understanding this, we've been offering programs in all 5 categories of the social determinants of health. And part of our model is partnering with federally qualified health clinics. So if you have an apartment community that works with Star C, basically we'll do on-site events in partnership with the federally qualified health clinics. And it's such a win-win for everyone. The health clinic gets to serve the community. Our tenants win by having access. There's fewer incidences in the emergency rooms. So I think a lot of healthcare providers and insurance companies are realizing this, and they're starting to get innovative in the way that they're bringing capital into housing. We just got our first $1 million grant from United Healthcare, and we're going to roll out programs that address the social determinants of health in our Atlanta portfolio, which is about 64,000 units. So we're really starting to see the healthcare providers understand that healthcare really starts with housing. And if tenants are not safely housed in healthy communities, then their jobs are much harder.
Yeah, I would imagine. I mean, just that description, it sounded like there's a lot of community engagement within that as well. And I know that's usually a big part of developments when you're trying to engage healthcare organizations and local communities, et cetera. So from your perspective, what are some of the best practices for community engagement from your experience?
So when we go into these blighted apartment communities, and that's the title of my book, Blighted, there is always a lack of community trust. So I think one of the best practices is patience, and understand that you're dealing with families that just don't trust. You know, they've been living next to drug dealers. They live in poverty. A lot of them are ashamed. Some of them just may not be employed, or they're embarrassed. So that's the value of bringing resources into our community, is that we really have the opportunity to work with our residents and help build trust. So from a best practices perspective, I think it has to be on a foundation of patience and trust, and understand that to engage tenants, you really have to come from their perspective.
From their perspective, yeah, that's I think you're probably the first person I've ever heard say that in that way, because I think that's kind of impactful. And matter of fact, speaking of impact, I know everybody always talks about these things that can be done, but what are the different ways that you're actually quantifying those impacts?
It's challenging. And, I'm a CPA also by training, so I love to measure things. Our typical Star C program in about a 200-unit apartment community generates just over $1 million in social impact. Some of the ways we measure it is below market rents. We have properties that are market rate properties that the landlord intentionally keeps rents around 35 to 40% AMI, which is significantly below market. But that creates disposable, discretionary dollars for our tenants. So we see the families in these very low income apartment communities, a lot of them migrate into home ownership because they have the ability to save money, to put down payments. A lot of them send their kids to college because they can afford it. So we really measure impact. We look at our rental rates. We look at how many children are participate in the program. We look at volunteer hours. We look at how many tenants basically utilize the partnership with the federally qualified health clinic. They'll use the federally qualified health clinic now as their medical home, so they're not in the emergency room. And then we look at milestone scores and basically report cards. There's a lot of different metrics. They're all a little bit different, and it's a hard thing to quantify, but typically we find we create about $1 million, sometimes as much as $2 million per year at each community through our metrics.
I mean, that is quantifiable for sure. And what about strategic partners? How do you go about identifying strategic partners and actually bringing them to the table? I would imagine with some of this quantifiable data that also assists in that effort.
So that's part of the social return. Our last deal, we raised $12 million. And if you have a social return of $1 million, I mean, that's an 8% social return. And we actually put that in our reporting. We do not have a lack of partners. About, 2015, we started doing a monthly breakfast, the Star C monthly breakfast. It's open to the public. It's the last Thursday of every month. And we have one at the end of this month. It's next week. And we're interviewing 4 chief magistrate court judges in various counties around Atlanta to talk about their eviction docket. We have over 300 people registered, a lot of landlords, a lot of property managers. And we find that by doing these monthly breakfasts, we've invited the public into our model. So we've had CEOs, we've had mayors, we've had landlords, we've had nonprofits, we've had tenants show up and understand how we engage with community and how they can be involved in our model. And so we really put the investment into building the brand in Atlanta. And that has really created a huge return in the form of community partners. I'll give you an example. So Georgia Power has a program where they'll come do energy upgrades for free at your apartment communities if you qualify. It's about $70,000 worth of free upgrades, but it saves each one of our tenants about $30 a month in energy bill. So that's just an example of kind of a unique partnership that's out there that not a lot of landlords are aware of. And I think pretty much the utility companies in every state have these type of partnerships. So through our Star C breakfast and just building our brand, we've really been able to develop a lot of fantastic community partnerships.
Wow. I didn't realize there was that many community partnerships out there, but it sounds like there are. And I guess they just need some direction. This has actually been great. So we're kind of backed up to our time frame here. But before we go, Marjy, what excites you about what it is that you're doing now as you look ahead at the rest of 2023 and beyond? What do you think is the next step?
So we are getting calls from landlords around the country, and we're thinking of taking the Star C model national to show other landlords around the United States about how they can build community partners, they can create social capital, which helps them raise money and build better affordable housing communities for their own neighborhoods. So that's what excites me is taking the Star C model national. Taking
it national. That is definitely I would like to see that.
So would I.
And Matt, thank you for jumping on and giving us some little insight to how you were able to meet up with Marjy. And I'm glad that there's integration in there with DevelUP that's happening in Atlanta. And that's it for this episode of BuzzHouse. Again, a big thanks to Marjy Stagmeier for joining the show to discuss how she is using her influence in the affordable housing space to improve communities. Once again, I'm Garrick Gibson. Thank you. Don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. For additional resources around multifamily housing, check out bakertilly.com. If you have a suggestion for the show, email us at build@bakertilly.com. That's BUILD@bakertilly.com. See you next time on BuzzHouse.